If you caught the previous essay episode, those chords are familiar. They're from Debussy's opera Pelléas et Mélisande, and Messiaen uses them as the starting point for discussion about a particular set of chords, chord constructs that he is fascinated by and uses in his music. Chords with the added sixths. Today we're going to talk more about the relationship between Debussy and Messiaen, and for this discussion I'm referring to an article written in the late 1960s by Roger Smalley, who was a pianist and a writer and a composer. Smalley wrote this article on the relationship between Messiaen and Debussy, the similarities and the differences. It's only a few pages long, but he lays out the discussion points in three main areas, similarities and differences in each of these. So first is Messiaen's use of Debussy through what Messiaen calls the compositional filter, where ideas, themes, melodies from Debussy find their way into Messiaen but are transformed through Messiaen's techniques. Second, the formal arrangement of the music, the structure that they both use, again, similarities and differences. And then third, where they overlap with their interest in symbolism, symbolist poems, symbolist poetry. So what does Messiaen mean when he says compositional filter? I talked about this in one of the other videos, and it's really, I think, one of the most interesting points that emerges from the study of the techniques. Is that Messiaen's very open, that he'll see or hear a melody from another piece of music, a composer that he admires, and he will take that and transform it into music of his own. But he never loses sight of the original source. And what he refers to as his compositional filters, I think, really equates to his compositional techniques. So, for example, he refers to the theme from Debussy's piano piece Reflets dans l'eau. In the book, it's example 85 in chapter 8, and he reduces it down to this: a descending fifth and a descending fourth. Debussy, of course, harmonizes it. For Messiaen, he's thinking of the ascending fifth and then the descending fourth. Now, what does he mean by compositional filter or transforming that? Well, he's going to look at one of his modes. And again, we haven't talked about modes yet because I'm moving in sequence through the techniques, and modes comes later. So we'll get to this. But the third mode so Messiaen takes the Debussy, the three notes written by Debussy at the start of his Reflets dans l'eau, and then that becomes instead of the fifth, of the tritone. And then so the idea of the compositional filter with Debussy as sort of a prime interjector into that compositional filter, right? A prime source. Source is a better word than interjector, but material that Messiaen is drawn to that passes through the filter of the modes, the filter of his rhythmic forms, the non-retrogradable rhythms. These are the elements, the techniques that Messiaen uses to take an idea that he finds emotionally rich, and then converts it into. Now we may find the connection tenuous, but the fact is that Messiaen highlights it in his writings and never backs down from it. It is very clear that Debussy, particularly those Peleas chords, feed into this sausage machine that is his compositional filter, and then out comes these other that was a little bit of Kaiser filter. Form. What Smalley says in the article is they are poetic music in the strict sense of the word, in that they are the product of a continuing thought process which produces a series of images related not by a background of musical logic, which can be precisely demonstrated, as in Beethoven or Schoenberg, but simply by the fact that they were generated by that same thought process. So when we look at Beethoven, Schoenberg, Brahms, we expect to be able to untangle the surface structure of the music and arrive at a structural and thematic process that explains the development of the piece. And it's appropriate that we think of the music like that. But that logic doesn't apply to a Debussy melody, which can meander through the course of the piece, which can develop in its own irrational format. And it exists simply because it exists. So with Messiaen, the music is there really to unfold these patterns, and that the rhythmic techniques are there to expand the horizontal basis of time, and the harmonic elements are there really to produce stasis rather than anything else. Stasis? Stasis? A static approach. Almost the opposite of development. If there's change in it, it is there to sort of highlight the essential similarity of the block of music. If a melody is augmented with an additional note, or all it really does in that little doodle is emphasize when you finally get the one wrong note really just emphasizes the structural stability of the rest of the piece. Here's how Smalley summarizes the formal differences. Debussy, contrasting and juxtaposing, arrived at the form not from a priori decisions that we tend to think Messiaen makes, but by way of the continuous morphology of the musical material. He says Messiaen is essentially static, like Gothic cathedrals, mountains, and glaciers. I like that image. One of the images that I refer back to in my meditation practice is the idea of sitting in the sort of cross-legged pose, very stable, like a mountain. And then my thoughts are like birds flying around that mountain. They come into the scene, they flutter around, and then they disperse. Or they continue to stay there. Right? The behavior of birds flying around a mountain is similar to the behavior of my thoughts as I sit in stillness. And I think that is a good juxtaposition. There's a morphology in Debussy, and there's a stasis in Messiaen. But neither composer follows a developmental logic. Do you know what I mean? this a priori decision. So Messiaen and Debussy are different, but they are inspired by, I think, a similar poetic of the music, a poetic logic that drives the unfolding of the music. And that ties into the third point here, that they are both symbolists. We think of Messiaen as a religious, liturgical composer, and he certainly was, but in his writings he's also very clear that he's influenced by some of the same symbolist poets that Debussy knew and was influenced by. Mallarmé, Paul Reverdy, these are names that come up often in Messiaen's writings. Even in the introduction to the techniques of the musical language, he refers to a whole slew of poets. Now, symbolism in a musical context, this is really interesting. Symbolism sort of suggests that behind what you're hearing is a set of impressions. The music and the language point to this occurrence behind the music, implied by the music, suggested by the music. What Messiaen has said is that he considered himself a symbolist poet who has written texts for his songs that multiply associations, relationships, and effects. That idea of multiplied associations, because they're implied, they're not stated directly by the music or by the text of the songs. They are symbols. You take the symbol, you drop it there, and you see what ripples out. Smalley calls this program music, which is in indefinite relationship to the program. And I kind of love that. Program music with an indefined relationship to the program. That relationship is this symbolic representation to multiple associations that can be pulled in through the experience and the phenomenon of the listener. Relationships and effects that are tied into the text and the music, but that ultimately extend into this spiritual realm beyond the sound.